The world economy did not simply recover from the Great Depression. It had to be rebuilt. By the early 1940s, the old financial order was gone. The gold standard, once the anchor of global trade, had fractured. Currencies had splintered into competing blocks. Nations had raised tariffs, imposed capital controls, and prioritized survival over cooperation. Trust between countries had evaporated. And then came war. The Second World War did not just devastate cities and industries. It exposed how fragile the global financial system had become. Trade routes were disrupted. Governments printed money to fund military expansion. Gold moved across oceans under armed guard. By the time the conflict began turning in favor of the Allies, one truth was clear. Even if peace returned, the world could not simply revert to the monetary system that had failed it. The pre-Depression model had promised stability through discipline. Fixed exchange rates tied to gold were meant to create predictability. But in crisis, that rigidity amplified collapse. Countries had been forced to defend their currencies while unemployment soared and banks failed. The lesson was painful but undeniable. Stability without flexibility can become instability itself. So, as the war raged on, policymakers began asking a question that would shape the modern world. What kind of monetary system could prevent another Great Depression? The stakes were enormous. If the post-war recovery faltered, political extremism could rise again. Trade wars could re-emerge. Economic nationalism could fracture fragile alliances. The economic mistakes of the 1930s were still fresh in memory. Competitive devaluations, protectionism, collapsing demand. No one wanted to repeat them. Across the Atlantic, the United States had emerged from the war years economically dominant. Its industrial base was intact. Its gold reserves were vast. Its currency was stable. But even American policymakers understood something critical. Prosperity could not be sustained in isolation. If Europe remained financially broken, global demand would remain weak. Recovery had to be international. In the United Kingdom, the situation was different. The war had drained its treasury. Debts had mounted. Its empire was financially stretched. British leaders knew they could not return to the old gold discipline without risking another contraction. They needed a system that allowed room to rebuild, not one that forced austerity at the worst possible moment. This tension created the central dilemma of the post-war world. How do you design a system that encourages stability without enforcing the kind of rigidity that caused collapse? The answer would not come from markets alone. It would not emerge naturally. It would have to be engineered, negotiated, constructed by economists, politicians, and central bankers who had lived through the trauma of systemic failure. They understood something fundamental. Money is not just metal or paper. It is a framework of agreements, a set of rules, a shared belief about value and exchange. And when those rules break, rebuilding them requires trust between nations, something far more fragile than gold. By 1944, with the war still underway but its outcome increasingly certain, representatives from dozens of Allied countries prepared to meet. Their goal was ambitious: create a monetary architecture strong enough to support global trade, flexible enough to prevent deflationary spirals, and cooperative enough to avoid another destructive race to the bottom. The Great Depression had shown what happens when countries retreat inward. The war had shown the cost of instability. Now the world stood at a crossroads. Either it would reconstruct a more resilient system, or risk repeating the cycle of collapse. Out of the ashes of broken currencies and shattered trust, a new financial order was about to be designed, and the decisions made in that moment would shape global power, trade, and money for generations. In July 1944, representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in the quiet town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The war was not yet over, but the financial peace was already being negotiated. The goal was simple to state and incredibly complex to achieve: design a monetary system that would prevent another Great Depression. Two dominant visions emerged. From the United Kingdom came the ideas of economist John Maynard Keynes. He argued that the world needed flexibility. Countries facing downturns should not be forced into brutal deflation just to defend a currency peg. He proposed an international clearing system, even a new global reserve currency, something neutral, not tied to a single nation. From the United States came Treasury official Harry Dexter White. His plan was more grounded in America's new reality. The U.S. held the majority of the world's gold. Its industrial economy was dominant. Rather than invent a new global currency, White's framework centered the system around the U.S. dollar, convertible into gold at a fixed rate. The debate was not just technical. It was about power. Would the post-war system be balanced between nations, or would it reflect the economic weight of the United States? After weeks of negotiation, compromise took shape. The new system would fix exchange rates, but not permanently. Countries could adjust their currencies under specific conditions. The dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. Gold would remain in the background, but no longer rule alone. To support this framework, new institutions were created. The International Monetary Fund would provide short-term financial assistance to countries facing balance of payments crises, preventing panic-driven collapses. The World Bank would help finance reconstruction and long-term development. For the first time, global monetary stability would not rely purely on metal reserves or rigid discipline. It would rely on cooperation and institutional support. The architects of Bretton Woods understood the lesson of the 1930s. When countries are forced to defend fixed exchange rates without assistance, they choose austerity, protectionism, and devaluation. This time, the system would include a safety valve. Temporary imbalances would not automatically spiral into catastrophe. But the compromise carried consequences. By placing the dollar at the center, the new order implicitly tied global liquidity to U.S. economic policy. As long as confidence in the dollar held, the system would function. If that confidence faltered, the entire framework could again come under strain. Still, in 1944, optimism prevailed. After depression and war, cooperation felt revolutionary. The delegates were not simply stabilizing currencies. They were attempting to stabilize the political future of the world. The Bretton Woods system did not promise perfection. It promised coordination. And compared to the fragmentation of the 1930s, coordination alone was progress. The world had chosen a new anchor, not pure gold, but structured cooperation backed by American economic strength. And for a time, it would work. For a generation, the new system worked. Under the Bretton Woods framework, currencies remained stable, trade expanded, capital flowed more predictably. The fear-driven devaluations and tariff wars of the 1930s did not return. Europe rebuilt, Japan industrialized. Global commerce accelerated at a pace the pre-war world had rarely seen. The institutions born in 1944, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, became pillars of international coordination. And at the center of it all stood the U.S. dollar, anchored to gold, trusted as the world's reserve currency. The architects of Bretton Woods had achieved something extraordinary. They created a system stable enough to encourage growth, yet flexible enough to avoid the rigid deflationary trap of the old gold standard. It was not automatic, it was managed, and that management made all the difference. But no monetary order is permanent. As global trade expanded and economies grew, the demand for dollars increased. The United States supplied them, running deficits, sending capital abroad, supporting reconstruction. Over time, more dollars circulated outside America than there was gold to back them at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Confidence, once the system's foundation, slowly became its vulnerability. By the late 1960s, strains were visible. Foreign governments began questioning whether the United States could maintain gold convertibility indefinitely. The balance between flexibility and discipline, the balance Bretton Woods had tried so carefully to design, was once again under pressure. In 1971, President Richard Nixon suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The link was severed. The era of fixed exchange rates anchored to gold officially ended. Yet this time, the collapse did not trigger another Great Depression. There were recessions, there were shocks, but the institutional framework, central banks, coordinated policy tools, international lending mechanisms remained intact. The world had learned how to respond to crisis with flexibility rather than rigidity. That is the lasting legacy of Bretton Woods. It proved that monetary systems are not natural forces. They are designed. They reflect power, negotiation, compromise, and historical experience. And when they fail, they can be rebuilt differently. The Great Depression exposed the danger of inflexible discipline. Bretton Woods introduced managed cooperation, and the modern floating currency era that followed embraced adaptability over metal-backed certainty. Each transformation came from the same realization. Stability is not about freezing a system in place. It is about building structures strong enough to bend without breaking. Empires rise on trade, production, and innovation. But beneath all of it lies something quieter, a shared belief in the monetary framework that connects nations. When that belief holds, growth becomes possible. When it fractures, the consequences echo across the globe. The world rebuilt money once before, after collapse, after war, after systemic failure. And the architecture created in that moment still shapes the global economy today. Empire economics is about those hidden foundations, the systems beneath the headlines that determine whether nations rise, fall, or endure. If you want to understand how global power is constructed and reconstructed, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.